Today, we're going to be talking to Rob Shea from H Care Communities, who manages over 50 locations across Canada. And we're going to learn about how they keep their teams motivated and organized. Hey, Rob, how's it going? How are you doing today?
So far, so good, Dan. It's still
Very
bright and early here in Calgary, but it's not raining at the moment. So happy about that. And also pleased to some degree that it's not 35 degrees Celsius here either.
well. Yeah, I know. We've had. Have you had some of those big like? Has it been pretty hot for you guys at certain points?
It's been a pretty temperate spring so far.
Oh,
The warm weather is due to start here on Friday. But for us, the warm weather is somewhere around 25 to 30 degrees. So
okay.
that's just perfect pool weather.
Yeah, that's right. So we've known each other for a while now. You are a customer of Maintenance Care. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about your background and just who you are and how you've come to be about in this role specifically.
Yeah, absolutely, Dan, and thank you for that. So yeah, I've been with Age Care now for, actually about 18 years in total. I did actually leave the organization for a few years. I got headhunted out, and I went and worked for another organization for about 3 years, and then I kind of got headhunted back. So this is kind of my second tour of duty with Age Care. Originally, I was in the role of executive director at Age Care. And so I was running seniors care homes, long-term care. So the first site that I managed was called the Glenmore here in Calgary. And after a few years, our owners started on an expansion, and I ended up at a location here in Calgary, a very large location. It was 3 buildings. The care center was 300 beds. Phase two of it was rental apartments with about 89 units. And then phase three of it, which was the third building, it was senior friendly apartments with rate reduction based on what seniors could afford to pay, that sort of thing. So at the end of the day, it had over just a little bit over 500 residents in total between the three different buildings. And I just think that the owners really liked the way that I, always managed the site, as far as, the way it looked, the way it felt, along with, always seeing, happy employees and happy staff. And then I moved into the corporate office as, basically looking after all food services, housekeeping, laundry, and facilities. But then aged care really started to expand. And so I didn't have the bandwidth to be able to continue to look after all of those. So they dropped out the laundry, the housekeeping, and the food services. And now I just look after the infrastructure for all of Canada, which is Ontario, Alberta, and BC. And I've been doing that now for about 3 years in total.
Wow, that. And how many locations do you guys have right now?
Right now, right across those three provinces, we're at 54 sites currently, and some new ones coming. We've got a number of projects in the ground here in Calgary. I know we've got a number of sites in Ontario that are getting kind of tired, and those will probably drop off the radar in the next few years and be replaced, hopefully, with some new modern facilities with any luck.
That's incredible. And I know that the other day I was talking to another gentleman who's exclusively running, I think about 5 to 10 locations using paper. Okay. And
Uh,
I know you're the polar opposite of that because you've utilized not just maintenance care, but other tools along with maintenance care that have, I've seen some of your reporting, for example, and it's just kind of the details and as I mentioned before, the trigger points where you measure success is so interesting to me. So how did you get into just technology in general? Like what's your interest in that?
I'll be very honest with you, Dan, is I've always, I guess, I wouldn't consider myself to be exceptionally tech savvy, but I certainly never like to be paying for software programs that we don't fully utilize. And to me, I've got a fabulous program that has really great capabilities. And one of the best capabilities of all is the ability to go and find things, which means that I don't ever need to keep paper around. Now, Dan, I think you've maybe seen my desk before, but you will see here that I really don't have any paper, and I really try not to keep any paper. In fact, just a while back, I was digging through one of our rooms here at the corporate office, and we found, a ton of manuals for one of our new properties. I'll say new property. The property was about 8 years old, but there was, 7 or 8 manuals that were sitting down there. Everything from plumbing to, electrical commissioning of the building, blueprints, the whole shooting match. And my first thought was, we got to get rid of these, get them to the site. And although there was a fair amount of work involved, we were able to utilize somebody on, modified duties to scan, take those documents, and match them up against the appropriate asset within maintenance care. So, needless to say, we took a crap load of paper. We're able to, get it back to a recycling facility, and not to mention the fact that we're able to free up a whole bunch of space here at the corporate office, et cetera. And the site was actually very thrilled to have those documents as well, because every time you need to have some kind of a project going forward, a major project, the first thing everybody asks for is, well, do you have blueprints? Do you have, construction designs, all of these kinds of things? And fortunately, in a lot of cases, especially when we do new builds now, we have all of that documentation from day one, which is so useful.
Oh, wow. So how do you deal with like, because I know one of the biggest obstacles we've seen is that, let's say you're working with your local fire marshal and inspector, and they want a paper copy, like they want a signature, they want something that's, that's not computerized. How do your facilities deal with that one-on-one?
Yeah, one of the things, of course, that we're of course funded, in all three provinces, in part and major part by the province. So legislation for us is always critical in everything that we do. Even to the point, and again, we're also accredited, our organization is an accredited facility. And so in a nutshell, you're always having to prove what you do. And so, the benefit of maintenance care, I think, is a great example, is that, when we have a company come out and they provide us with, say, sprinkler systems, I think is a great example. We require a certificate for that sprinkler system. We require, the company that provides the system, they need credentials, they have to have insurance, warranties, absolutely everything around that sprinkler system. We actually, of course, have the sprinkler system in. We would typically enter it in as, three different sections. We'd have the fire alarm, we would have the wet system, and if the site has a dry system. So depending on the type of documentation that we have, or what is being certified, even to the fire hydrant on the exterior of our building, you can find out whatever detail you want about that fire hydrant just by, opening up that asset in maintenance care, and everything you could possibly want is right there. As far as the fire marshal is concerned, sometimes we do take those certificates and post them in the mechanical rooms downstairs, but I do really encourage people to just simply keep them in maintenance care against the asset. So anybody at any time, even if somebody's on vacation, they're just going to go into that asset maintenance care, bring it up. In a few circumstances, you get an inexperienced user. They'll call me and say, Rob, the fire marshal's here. What do I do? They're looking for this. I'll bring it up. I'll put it on screen with the team meeting. In 2 minutes, the fire marshal says, "Thank you very much," and walks out the door, very happy kind of thing.
And it's funny because we get those calls too. How do I print this off? The fire marshal's here. That's amazing. I mean, I'd say out of all of our customer base, you definitely, and one of the reasons I did want to talk to you specifically is you're one of our biggest, most super users of the system in that not only do you have good processes as far as what your team needs to do on a regular basis to keep the system up, but the way you even organize it to begin with, and set them up for success. This is how we do it. This is what you're going to do, and so on. So, how big is your team? How many people on your team help train all these people and get them onboarded and so on?
Yeah, so as good of a user as I am, Dan, you've met Ryan on my team, and he's my regional facility manager for all of Alberta. And I will tell you, he is absolutely spectacular when it comes to, utilization of the system. But more importantly, we do try to design it anytime something comes up. And so you will see, as I'll give you an example, Dan, in maintenance care, although you wouldn't think asbestos, for example, is an asset, we've actually made asbestos an asset at many of our sites. And the reason we've done that is because we have documents that, have maps in our sites to show where asbestos is located.
Oh,
We've had asbestos reports to say, okay, it's in your drywall mud, it's in this floor, all of those kinds of things. So typically you wouldn't see asbestos as an asset somewhere, but we identify it as an asset. We also identify it in the drop down list as a documentation only. So there's no cost associated with it, those kinds of things. So we're always looking, I guess, for bigger and better ways to utilize it so we can extract information easily. One thing, Dan, that we don't like to do as the infrastructure team is to reach out to a site and say, can you tell me how many residents do you have? What is the square footage of your room? When is your fire system due for inspection? It's just all there in maintenance care. And when we also go out and our regional field teams go out to the sites, and they do a couple of different inspections on an annual basis, and one of them is a compliance/risk inspection.
okay.
And we actually do go in and search documentation within maintenance care. So very often we will get tasks that are closed, but we'd open up the task and see there's no supporting documentation, as an example. So when we go out and we do these inspections at sites, we go in with the team. So the executive director would be there, the facility manager would be there. And ultimately, we would go and check and see, well, this document's not here, or this document's not here. And again, we don't do it from a fault finding perspective, Dan. It's simply a fact finding perspective. And so if it's not there, we basically give them a timeline. Very often we create a task, another task to get that task done. That way we can also monitor it on a weekly or a 14-day or a 30, 60, 90-day report to ensure that it is done. That also did remind me, Dan, you did ask about the size of my team. So we do have just one regional facility manager in Ontario, one in Alberta, and one in British Columbia, supported by myself. We also have Jackie that works out of our Toronto office. And for all major projects, Jackie puts together, does the debrief, does the quotation review, those kinds of things before we work on major projects. So it's a small team, but it's very, very efficient.
Yeah, I've noticed that. I mean, it's like I said, you guys, and also you motivate your team. That wasn't the only. It's not just about applying, these kind of regulations to make sure that everybody's doing the same thing. We've talked before about how, well, you don't just want to tell them what to do. You want to get their buy-in, and you do that by encouraging, showing their progress, and giving them goals to achieve that they feel happy that they're achieving. So that's definitely been part of your success. Has that been on purpose? What's been your plan around that?
Yeah, I think, Dan, that's, prior to joining the healthcare industry, I worked in a different industry that I would suggest was very competitive. But it's important to know that it was competitive in a very friendly way. And so, one of the things that we found with maintenance care, it really is simple to give people data that they can look at. They're not threatened by it in any manner. But the people that are already doing good can see clearly where they are as far as even something like the number of tasks being done in a day, a week, a month. But we also divide those number of tasks by the number of maintenance personnel at the site. And that way, then you got a sort of a fair playing field, et cetera. And of course, now with 54 sites, there's a number of teams that, sort of in that top 10 that are always trying to outdo somebody else. And even the people that are at the bottom, it's really important, Dan, that we never ever send it out from a shaming perspective. But nobody ever likes to see themselves at the bottom. The interesting thing is because we have so many measurables from maintenance care, is even the sites that are at the top in a lot of areas aren't necessarily at the top in every area. And even some of the sites that are at the bottom, maybe that they're low in getting tasks completed, but they're high in other areas, for example. And so we will share that in different methodologies, in different ways, in different sorts, if you will. So that way there's a bit more of a balance. And again, we always emphasize this is not fault finding, it is fact finding. Even when we found some sites that were getting more tasks going into the system than were being completed, they felt, you know what, I just keep falling further and further behind. We designed that spreadsheet that I think I shared with you, Dan, in a way that basically said, if you actually did, just one more task a day, you would actually, at the end of the year, be ahead. And I was really amazed that when we did that, is that about 90% of our sites went from being negative to being positive just by bringing it up in that perspective. Like we had some sites that only needed to do, one more task a week, and that would make them positive. And then before you know it, every single one of our sites, Dan, was on the positive side, meaning that we're now at a point where we have sites where we run out of tasks to do.
Wow.
And some people will say, well, maybe you've got too many maintenance personnel there. So I don't necessarily share that kind of detail too broadly. But really what we were trying to do was just to make sure that sites, we're not falling behind, because you fall behind 100 over the course of a year. Well, after 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, now you're going to be 400 behind, 500 behind, and you're just going to keep getting into a bigger and bigger hole. Fortunately, Dan, that's not the case.
Yeah, I mean that's the simple math of it. One extra every day. It's the consistency that works, and you measure all those metrics well, and also show your team those metrics and make them understand it. And I think that's kind of a big part of the success there. And so tell me, about your previous industry that you were in and how different it was. Like what industry was it in, and what's the, compared to senior care, what are some of the differences, and just generally how how the maintenance teams behaved at the locations, and how you interacted with the different people in the environment.
Yeah, well, actually, I used to work for Cineplex Entertainment for about 28 years before I joined aged care, actually, Dan.
So you started when you were 10 years old?
14
Yeah.
actually,
Oh,
working
wow.
working as a movie usher in Kingston, Ontario, and I actually managed my first drive-in movie theater when I was 17 in Kingston, Ontario, and I closed the last drive-in in Toronto, which was in Markham. Back in 1985 is when it closed. An old four screen drive-in movie theater many years ago, but it was a lot different on the maintenance side of things. Working in the movie industry, Dan, is they didn't really pay as much attention to maintenance. And when something broke, it was more a case of, well, you call a plumber, you call an electrician. You didn't really have a guy. Now, I did have the benefit because of my skill set, I guess, around maintenance and those kinds of things, etc. Is that I was able to fix a lot of things that other people neglected, or they wouldn't call a contractor in just to fix a couple of seats. They would wait till there's 10 or 15 seats broken, then they would call somebody in. But my site never had broken seats because I fixed them as they broke, kind of thing. And so, I guess that got me noticed a little bit, because every time somebody had walked in from the corporate office, from Cineplex, my location always looked spectacular. And ultimately that got me into, the regional director for Western Canada. And I did all the way from Winnipeg to Vancouver Island in the movie business. But unfortunately, the movie business at that time was growing, just like aged care is currently growing. And I lost my job on the seventh merger with the organization, but they took great care of me, and I fell into this job, very shortly after. And again, a lot of it was based on that experience that I have from the movie theaters, and it's certainly great memories for sure, Dan, but a lot different. They're a lot different, but at the end of the day, always went into it with sort of a customer service focus, and that certainly pays dividends always.
Yeah, and there's, I would imagine, less regulation than in senior care, especially back then. I would imagine, those regulations have only but increased. But, how was it when you came into the senior care industry and you realized, wow, there's, we're being watched and we're being monitored and graded based on a lot of different things. I would assume that there'd be quite a different culture just around that.
Yeah, Dan, one of my, and I still think of this. I find it a little funny. Is you know, I think within the second week I had started, we were actually in the accreditation process, and we had a health inspector come to my site at Glenmore. I'd only been there for a few weeks, and the health inspector had identified, two, three, maybe four issues at the site. And anyways, about a week later, it ended up on the regional director's desk, this health inspection. And so she came into my office, and she said, Rob, she said, this is a perfect example of where a gap analysis would be very helpful. And I said, I'm sorry, I've never heard of a gap analysis. Can you tell me what that is? And she says, well, what a gap analysis is, you identify something that's wrong, and then you talk about what you're going to do to fix it. And I said, well, all of those items are already fixed. I said, in fact, we fixed them on the date that the health inspector came in. And she says, oh, okay. And she says, well, this one's a bit bigger. How were you able to fix that? And I told her what we did. And she says, well, okay, we don't usually have people move this fast, but it's funny where we came from. If it's broken, you fix it. Here, in healthcare, if it's broken, you talk about it, and then you talk about how you're going to fix it, and then you fix it. So anyways, that was a bit of a learning for me. But really, more than anything, Dan, she was looking for documentation to show that, when we've got something that isn't working perfectly, what are the steps that we take to ensure that it does work perfectly. But instead of doing gap analysis, I would rather, every time that fire marshal comes in, every time the health inspector comes in, we prefer just to, hit the targets right off the get-go, rather than have a need to do a gap analysis to start with, kind of thing. So that was absolutely new to me, and it was a little bit strange. I certainly get it now. But again, I think that's been a big part of our success, is that if something's broken, let's get it resolved now. But even better, and this is where maintenance care really helps us, is to be more proactive about things, um, rather than reactive.
Yeah. Wow, that's hilarious. The now, as far as you've got facilities all across the country, how have you found the staffing for maintenance been? Is it different across the country, different provinces? It's been okay, or is there a lot of turnover? What's been your experience lately related to staffing?
Yeah, well, I kind of hate to say this, Dan, but at aged care, like all providers, they do struggle a little bit, especially in British Columbia right now is a huge challenge. They've identified, more than 2,000 vacancies in the province, just on the care side. So healthcare aides, LPNs, registered nurses, sort of as a starting point. But the infrastructure department has actually maintained really great staffing levels right across Canada. We struggled very little. Again, I think a lot of it, in part, as you know, Dan, I know there's great training available from maintenance care, but we do our own training. Just because I think it's important, based on my own training that I had used from a previous CMMS system. We actually had, I guess, he was a very patient trainer, if you will. And the approach that I wanted more than anything was, I want to just learn certain aspects of it. And once I learned it, then I wanted to move on to the next things. Because again, your program itself, it really has, many fingers at the end of the day. And I just find if we move faster than somebody's ready to move, um, then you have a tendency to lose some of those people.
Yeah.
And, even with Ontario coming on board, we had a number of people that said, yeah, I think I'm going to have to pack up. I don't know how to use computers. I don't even know how to turn a computer on. Um, but our first training sessions were really not about how to use maintenance care. Our first training sessions were more about the capacity and capability of what this program can do for you. So the first thing that we did is we got their interest. We showed them, and of course, we're getting lots of wows. This is incredible, that kind of thing. And we just said, look, we take it a step at a time, a day at a time. We provided group training, but we've also provided one-on-one training as well, where that was necessary. And I think that's the sort of thing that if we train them at their level and what they're ready for, and we still have people at this point in Ontario that are simply just opening tasks and closing tasks. That's really all they're capable of doing. And we've been using the program since April 1st. But about 90% of the sites are starting to put assets into the system. They're starting to link tasks into those assets. And slow and steady wins the race. Even in Western Canada, where we've been using it for a number of years, we have some that I would deem to be absolute super users, and we still have some people that are using it at the basic level. We're ready to move forward with them when they're ready to move forward.
Yeah, I've seen this scenario before. You imagine when we started 20 years ago, nobody was using computers hardly, and and they were using their pagers, and in every instance you had somebody who was very capable at their job, just this computer skills maybe weren't there. And so we always wanted to go slow and make sure that they're learning the basics, and it's easy to do and it helps them, and then they can grow whenever they're ready, like you said. So when you're looking at your teams across the country, how do you like, because there's some parts of the job that are quite difficult to learn, or it takes time to learn. Let's say the regulations around fire safety and so on, and they, I would assume, don't all come in with that education. Do you provide anything around that scenario? How do you help your teams grow in their maintenance skills themselves?
Yeah. So again, my three regional facility managers are all very, very adept. Darren in Ontario, He's been working with, well, Age Care since September 6th last year. He worked for Chartwell for 20 plus years prior. Absolutely adept. Ryan comes from oil and gas. And so he's absolutely fantastic. He's got his class 4 boiler certificate. Again, very adept on all things HVAC. Now, Regav out in BC, he comes in with a lot less experience, but I'll tell you, he's got such a great can do attitude, Dan. And you show him once and he learns immediately. So, having that depth of team is very helpful, first and foremost. But when we create PMs, as an example, we don't just say, go out and do that, fire extinguishers. We actually have a list of those 5 or those 6 things that you must do when you inspect that fire extinguisher. So you got to lift it up and make sure that it's full. You have to make sure that the gauge on it is reading in the green. You have to check the nozzle on it to make sure it's not blocked. You have to make sure that little pin is in place, and you got to make sure that little vinyl thing on there is holding it in place, those kinds of things, and then it's been signed. And so those step-by-step instructions are all in our PMs as well, Dan, and that's the sort of thing that is very helpful. If the checklist becomes too big, then we will utilize a checklist that they complete the PM with, but when they're finished, then they scan that checklist into the PM for the month.
Oh, okay. So do you sometimes use contractors for your preventative maintenance, or like, 'cause some people like to pass on the liability, let's say, and say, okay, I'm going to
Yeah,
use them for HVAC or whatever is the case.
correct.
Is that part of your kind of decision making process sometimes?
Yeah, so we have, I think just simple and easiest one is that every quarter, our HVAC technicians come to the site. They have a list of things that they must check off. Yes, we changed your filters. Yes, we inspected the pulley. We inspected the belt. The belt didn't need to be replaced this quarter. As an example, those kinds of things. And the good thing, Dan, we never lose a belt, which is great, because there's nothing worse than having to have a technician come back, from your HVAC company because they didn't change, the $10 belt, that sort of thing. So when they're finished with those inspections, same thing. So we have a PM task in the system. And then when that has been completed, then it is the document is uploaded against that specific group of assets,
Oh,
if
wow.
you will.
Yeah.
And if there's any identified deficiencies, Dan, then a new task must go into the system until that deficiency's been resolved.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing. So do you run your household the same way as you do your day-to-day business world?
You know what? Especially over the summer, Dan, I'm on a 4-day work week, so I take Fridays off. But the nice thing is on Friday, I do all the things I would have to do on Saturday, Sunday. So Saturday, Sunday, I can just float in the pool and have a nice cold beverage. But
Nice.
I don't use maintenance care for it, but I do make a list of all the things that I need to do on the weekend that I try to get done on Friday.
Very good, very good. Well, I mean, I think we've covered a lot of interesting topics. Is there anything else you want to share with us about where you're headed as far as a company, or kind of
Yeah.
your advice related to maintenance techs out there that might want to get into this career and so on?
Yeah, Dan, the one piece we never really chatted about, but where we're getting to is useful life of equipment, which I think is, it is really laid out so well in maintenance care. But we're hopeful that by next year, that at least 50% of our sites will just be able to take a report off of maintenance care to show our assets that we must review for capital budgeting purposes. So, the nice thing about maintenance care, it's in there twice, the expected life, the expected useful life, but then there's another one that indicates where is it at today? So we may have an HVAC unit that we're expecting to last 25 years. But what ends up happening is that we've got one out of the 30 that may be on a rooftop, as an example, and there's one or two that are just always causing us problems. And so we will adjust that from 25 years down to, say, 20 years because it's giving us grief. And so then it's going to pop up on our capital list 5 years sooner. And so then what happens is when it comes time for capital planning, and we're already, believe it or not, working on that for 2025, we will take those reports off of maintenance care and say, okay, this is so showing that this is now at 110 or 115% of its useful life. Now that gives us the ability, do we have enough money to change it this year? Because if we don't, then we're going to be spending another $5,000 or $6,000 every year until we replace this unit, which we don't want to do because it's just always problematic. And that's the one feature that we're growing towards with maintenance care, but we're very excited because there's a lot of work in capital planning, and there's nothing worse, Dan, than saying, this is the elevator we're going to replace this year. And so you move forward with replacing that elevator only to have another one die on you. And so really what we want to do is to make sure that we're always selecting the right HVAC unit, the right boiler, the right elevator. And now we can do that because we've got history on every one of these assets. And that's the stuff that is just so helpful and keeps us organized when it comes to capital planning, if you will.
Well, you just made me think of a new report we could create where we can compare, especially because you have multiple sites. If you have a certain piece of equipment, let's say it's a boiler or something like that, that you want to replace potentially, it can show you other boilers in that report that will tell you these are also, you can consider replacing at the same time. There, maybe you can negotiate a bigger rate for buying more than one. So, that might be something that could be helpful. So we'll work on that report.
Actually, Dan, we take it as far, and again, we really almost approach it mathematically, if you will. If I've got a site with 100 beds, for example, and I need a bed has a lifespan of 20 years. If I don't change 5 of those beds every single year, there's going to come a point in the future where I have to buy more beds than I have money for. And so the nice thing is again, this is where maintenance care comes in. I take a list of all my beds. We have to do an annual assessment of every single bed in the place. And that way I know exactly which beds need to be taken out. And in fairness, even in some cases, even though, the bed that is destined to go out, it's due for replacement, we will still take all the motors off of it. We'll take the actuators off of it. And then we'll send it to a scrapyard for steel and get a little bit of money back for it, kind of thing as well. So that does enable us to really keep our equipment in place as long as we possibly can.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for being a customer, being such a great customer, and also for doing this, because I know that your knowledge is extensive and you've shared a lot with us today. I'm sure there's tons more, but I know a lot of people are going to learn a lot from what you just said. So that's very appreciated. Thank you very much. And, hope we can do this again in the future.
Anytime, Dan, and we just appreciate everything that maintenance care does for us. And you guys have been nothing but a great partner. So thank you as well.
All right. You take care.
All the best, Dan.